Why now? Why sanctions so thoroughly this time on coal, which is the major import from DPRK for China?
Well, why now? Obviously, because the latest ballistic missile tests conducted by DPRK. For DPRK, they proud that it was a great successful test, but it's a really serious violation, further violation of UNSC resolution. So China has expressed our opposition rhetorically, and the latest sanction measures is action to represent our opposition.
Does it have much to do with the apparent death of Mr. Kim Jong-nam,
Well,
the
no.
half-brother of Mr. Kim Jong-un?
No, up to now, even up to this point, no one have the conclusion say the assassination have a linkage with Pyongyang. No one dare to say that because it's far from the clear conclusion conducted by Malaysian authorities.
All right.
So Chinese policymaker made a decision about coal sanction without consideration of this sad incident.
Okay. Professor Lee, even though there is sanctions, it's not just about China, but also other countries. How to enforce sanctions, that's a big question mark. Of course, you could always do off-the-book imports and exports. You could also do a little bit loose inspections. You could also do things on a humanitarian basis, which might on the verge of sanctions. So, Professor Lee, how to enforce, that's a big question mark, not just for China, for other countries as well.
Well, first, I think this is a most reasonable, appropriate policy decision by China. This will send a message to North Korea: beware, China will not forever be patient and put up with North Korea's flagrant violations of many UN Security Council resolutions that China has supported. At the same time, of course, China is not willing to induce the collapse of the DPRK. That would be, from China's point of view, self-defeating. China now arguably enjoys the greatest influence over both Koreas, over the Korean Peninsula, since perhaps the mid-19th century. So China will put some hurt on North Korea. At the same time, sanctions have many loopholes. Sanctions are no panacea. Diplomacy is no panacea. So, as you suggest, there are ways for North Korea to diversify revenue-generating schemes. And in the short term, I think North Korea will feel the pinch, but it remains to be seen whether this action will bring about any fundamental change in North Korea's nuclear policy.
Okay, before I go to Mr. Walsh, let me come back to you, Mr. Yang, to respond to what Professor Lee just said. Coal, zinc, copper, these are all imports coming from DPRK into China. Of course, it's not just for China. Coal, though, it's mainly to China.
Yep.
So how long do you think the Chinese government will stick to this sanction mechanism as far as we are still going to see new development from the DPRK on the nuclear issue?
Well, if you read the executive order issued by Commerce Ministry of China, it stated very clearly from today, say the February 19th, to the last day of this year, that the door closed.
For coal imports?
For coal imports or for DPRK's coal export. But regarding to the question, so what about the next year? I think it's up to DPRK, not up to China. If DPRK return to right direction and return to the table for the negotiation through talks to solve the issue, I think the door will be reopened, or no.
We have been reading very mixed messages actually coming from Pyongyang. We all know coal export, particularly to China, is one of the biggest export chunk from DPRK for any country. However, at the same time, we hear words coming from figures in DPRK suggesting, well, this sanction is not likely to have much impact. Ri Ji-sung, for example, a DPRK economist, said restrictions on Pyongyang's ability to sell raw materials, including coal, barely impeded the country's economic growth or having any impact on the country. That was he said in a CNN interview. He said the DPRK doesn't feel much affected by restrictions as they don't promote the export of raw materials, including coal. According to him, the country is earning money from tech exports to Southeast Asia, including precision computer, numerical control systems, and processed raw materials like magnesite and graphite, and also zinc products. So, Mr. Walsh, I want you to comment about this response coming from DPRK and Economist.
Well, of course, that's what he'd say. It's just not true. There's a reason why 90% of all trade with the DPRK is with China, and that's because not only is China an active economy on the border, but it's also because trade has fallen away with the other countries as political pressure has increased. With more UN resolutions and sanctions and active diplomacy on the part of South Korea, fewer and fewer countries are trading with South Korea. So as a consequence, statistically, it's become more and more concentrated with China. So I think that's just highly unlikely. And I think, when we come to this issue, there are skeptics and there are believers.
Okay.
And they both have strong arguments. The skeptics say, well, you had these sanctions last year and you still sold a lot of coal, more coal than you were supposed to. And the believers say, look, the markets in China are already responding. They're already factoring in this as something that's going to be enforced. So I don't know which way it is, but I agree with my colleagues. It will depend on the behavior of future actors, not only North Korea, but also South Korea and the U.S. If things start to move in a positive direction towards some restraint and negotiation, then those restrictions may soften. But if not, it'll depend on who's blamed, and it could go in any direction.
Well, as we always remember some of the teachings from the predecessors, carrots and sticks work together once they are being exercised. But Mr. Walsh, the point is, do we know at all by any country, any individual outside DPRK as to the financial situation of that specific country, how much money that country still has in banks around the world, how much international transaction it could accomplish even with these kind of sanctions, what kind of road that they go around in order to achieve their financial goals. The question is, do we really know when we are celebrating so-called the achievements of sanctions or possible achievements?
It's a great question. We know more than we used to. But there's still a lot that we don't know, and my guess is there's still a lot the North Koreans don't know about their own economy.
Okay.
Writ large, clearly Pyongyang as a city has grown wealthier over time. There are all sorts of indicators for that. But I would not be overly confident if I was a North Korean policymaker. And I think most of those funds that they have overseas are in provincial Chinese banks, and they are a vulnerability as well as an asset.
Okay, Mr. Yang, since Mr. Walsh mentioned China again, you have to respond to that.
Well, let me say the true story. Many people know there are big five Chinese banks, state-owned banks, big five. All the big five closed down all of the accounts in DPRK banks. Now there remain a very few Chinese banks, which is a very, very small and very, very local. They have accounts in DPRK's banks for very small trade transaction services. And based on the latest resolutions, I'm afraid most of the small banks also closed down the transaction.
Because there's a so-called second-hand transaction.
Yeah, because of the secondary boycott mechanism. They are afraid, of the indirect influences.
Yes.
So closed down, and also because of the ban on coal, zinc, copper, and so on. That's not necessary to keep the account open.
Okay.
So that's the real situation.
Very interesting. All you have briefed our audience, but here is the question, Professor Lee. As we say, carrots and stick, as we also say, sanctions, punishment, and yet at the same time to avoid a total collapse, that's not good for anyone at this point in our world today, let's just say. Professor Lee, if we don't have enough information about DPRK, How can we do that balance well when sanction is being exercised, Professor Lee?
Well, diplomacy and sanctions are not mutually exclusive, as we know. Carrot and stick doesn't mean just all carrots or all stick. Diplomacy bereft, deprived of that key coercive element, is only then emasculated into appeasement. Sanctions without an exit strategy, without a scheme for gradually relaxing sanctions in return for positive action from the target nation, may lead to war. So I think the problem is not that we have used only sanctions or only diplomacy in the past, but that we have not been able to calibrate the degree of pressure and inducements. This latest move by China is, on one level, an invitation and inducement to the United States to return to negotiations and also to make some compromise itself. So I think this is the right move. We don't know how much North Korea has in its offshore accounts, but we do know that North Korea's international transactions are still primarily denominated in US dollars. That's according to the latest UN panel of experts report from 2015-16 and the one just to be released soon. So that makes North Korea vulnerable. The fact that North Korea still prefers the US dollar gives the US some leverage to block those international transactions. And as Mr. Yang said, China's big banks in the past, in 2013, for example, voluntarily cut off all money transfer with a designated North Korean bank, the Foreign Trade Bank. So banks are very sensitive to such measures.
I see. But still, there is the question about sanctions vis-a-vis engagement, as Mr. Lee have just mentioned. And at the same time, sanctions yet not collapse. Mr. Walsh, how do you think that tightrope can be walked? Go ahead, sir.
Well, I think you're absolutely right to put your finger, I think, on this. It is a very delicate balance. Right now we have all sanctions and no diplomacy, so clearly there is room for discussion, whether it's in the six-party talks, in the New York Channel, or elsewhere. We need more diplomacy to round out the sanctions that we have. But your question earlier, I think, is right. We don't really have very precise information about the North Korean economy, and so if we turn the sanctions dial 2 notches, do we get 2 notches of pressure or 8 notches of pressure and a potential collapse? Frankly, no policymaker knows the answer to that question, and everyone is just sort of feeling their way along a little bit at a time. And there's a lot of risk no matter what you do here.
Mr. Yang, there is the risk when sanctions being exercised, when economic situation inside the DPRK deteriorated as a result or not, that the leader of DPRK might resort to even more effort on nuclear tests, because that's one of the lifelines of governance, I guess, for that specific country. Mr. Yang, therefore, here's the issue. Sanctions and engagement. Sanction easy to do. You just do it from outside the country. Engagement, it takes 2 to tango, and probably even 6 if we talk about the 6-party talks. That's a hard dance, you know that. Mr. Yang, where are we in terms of engagement now?
Well, unconditional resumption of 6-party talks and any other form of the bilateral or multilateral talks would be very helpful to compose the momentum.
Well, that's undiplomatic. Mr. Yang, let me just put word here. Mr. Trump, before he came into the White House, he said this to the Fox News. He said, China has total control of DPRK. Of course, we know that's not true. Mr. Trump, you already go 100 notch over than the reality. But the question is, whether China will have the capability to put in all of these key players, South Korea, for example, United States, back to the negotiation table, at least back to the talk table.
Well, no, China has no any power to dictate any players, especially the North Korea. Control, regarding to your control, in Chinese foreign, vocabulary of Chinese foreign policy, there's no such a term control. We never try to control any country, including North Korea. And we have limited influences on North Korea. And what we want to do and can do is build architecture under which both pressures and access are existing opportunities and pressures compose the architecture. And we want North Korea to make a choice between the dark future or bright future.
Okay, Mr. Walsh. Earlier, Professor Lee already said China did its part with this recent sanction. United States, what has it done? What could it do?
Well, I think that's the big question going forward, but I would include South Korea with that. I was a little disappointed to read this morning a report coming out of the Munich conference that the Secretary of State Tillerson and the South Korean foreign minister met, and the South Korean foreign minister's purpose was to persuade the American Secretary of State that we should not engage in negotiations, that it should be a all-pressure policy without change. I mean, I don't know if that reporting is correct. If it is correct, it's disappointing. I think the way to build some momentum here is China has done something positive. It would be great if the South Koreans and the Americans can find a way to reciprocate, and then therefore everyone be on a unified page, forcing North Korea to respond and rejoin some sort of negotiation.
Right.
But if South Korea or the U.S. refuses, then we're all back to square one, and everyone's divided rather than acting in unison.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said very clearly at the Munich Security Conference, Professor Lee, that it takes all parties' efforts to put the things back on track when it comes to engagement. So, what can the U.S. do right now? We understand, Professor Lee, one word, that there has been discussions about the so-called 1.5 track between DPRK senior officials and retired officials from the United States, even though State Departments are suggesting it still has not yet processed the visa of these so-called senior officials coming from DPRK for a talk in the US. But these are all media reports. So, Professor Lee, shine some light for us.
You know, talking for the sake of talking is not very effective. Let's talk to North Korea, people say, without really having a plan in place. Let's talk to North Korea is to diplomacy what let's stare at the sun maybe to astronomy. Both could lead to blindness. I think the United States needs to inflict some financial cost on North Korea and then go back to negotiations from a position of strength. And the same goes for South Korea and Japan. So yes, there will come a time for multilateral and bilateral negotiations, but only after we have shown that we mean business and that we are in a position and we have the intention of inflicting some financial cost on the North Korean regime.
Agree with that? Further sanctions? Will that bring back the DPRK?
To some degree, I agree with that. We need to go dual track, say, both sanctions and talks, both pressures and engagement.
For every country?
Yeah, and we need to, the key word is joint efforts.
Okay, before we go, final words from you as well, Mr. Walsh. South Korea rather, likely to experience a government change in a few months, and also the United States struggling internally, politics. Anything significant likely to follow with the policies and strategies related toward DPRK? Briefly.
You know, it's a good question. I think all this is going to take time. The U.S. isn't going to want to do anything dramatic without being in consultation with its ally, South Korea, and South Korea can't have a policy until it has a new president. So, until the U.S. president has his full national security team in place. So I think right now we're in a period of waiting, where everyone sort of gets their act together, and hopefully the North Koreans won't test, while we're waiting to get settled.
Well,
and it will be only then, when the U.S. and all the parties are ready, that they'll have these real policy reviews and discussions.